The morning air was cold and heavy as he walked toward the mine, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Even though he had been going down into that dark, suffocating place for years, each day still carried a little weight of fear, a little nervousness, and a lot of responsibility. He adjusted the strap of his helmet, feeling the familiar scratch of sweat and dust, and reminded himself that today would be just another day, like all the others. Yet deep down he knew that every day in the mine could change a life in an instant. And he carried that thought quietly with him. He greeted his co-workers as they gathered near the entrance, their faces tired but alert. Some had been working in the mine for decades, others were younger, just starting out, learning the ropes of a life most people on the surface would never understand. He nodded at the foreman, a man who had been running the mine for years, his face weathered by years of dust and sun. They shared a mutual respect that was unspoken, but deeply understood. He knew the foreman relied on him, trusted him in ways that went beyond orders or rules, and that trust was something he carried seriously. As he entered the mine, the sunlight faded behind him, swallowed by the dark tunnels that stretched endlessly underground. The smell of damp earth, iron, and stone filled his lungs, and for a moment he closed his eyes and breathed it in. This was home in a way most people would never understand. The walls of rock were unyielding, the paths narrow, and the air thick with a mixture of fear and determination. Here every step mattered. Every sound was a warning, every shadow a potential danger. But he had learned to move with confidence, to read the mine like it spoke a language only he could understand. Years of experience had honed his instincts, and those instincts would serve him well, though he didn't know it yet. The day started as usual, with men spread across different shafts, pickaxes in hand, slowly chipping away at the rock, extracting the minerals that kept their lives moving above ground. He worked methodically, the rhythm of the strike familiar, almost comforting. He glanced around, checking on others, making sure no one was too close to a risky wall, making sure the younger miners didn't get careless. He was not the boss, but in many ways he carried the weight of responsibility for everyone's safety. It wasn't about heroism. It was about caring for people he spent long hours with in a dangerous place. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting a dim glow that barely reached the deeper tunnels. Inside, the mine seemed alive with sounds, the scraping of tools, the distant echo of falling stone, the low murmur of men talking quietly. He knew the mine's moods as well as he knew his own. Sometimes it was calm, sometimes it groaned like an old beast waking from a nap. The older miners often warned the younger ones about the subtle signs, a tiny crack that could widen, a sudden shift in the air pressure, a faint rumble deep below. He paid attention to all of it, not just for himself, but for everyone who trusted him in these dark, unforgiving tunnels. The foreman appeared near his section, clipboard in hand, observing quietly. The man's eyes scanned the mine, measuring progress, noticing potential dangers, but also noticing small acts of care, like how he made sure the younger workers had support when lifting heavy rock, or how he checked that the ventilation was working properly in the deeper shafts. There was something unspoken between them, a recognition of reliability, of loyalty, of the quiet heroism that often went unnoticed. The foreman didn't need words to know that this man would act when others hesitated, that he would risk his own safety if it meant keeping someone else safe, and that trust was mutual. He respected the foreman's guidance, the way decisions were made, and the way he treated the men like more than just laborers. As the morning progressed, the mine's rhythm continued. Sweat ran down his face, dust coated his skin, and the sound of stone hitting metal echoed endlessly. Still, there was a sense of calm in the routine, a strange serenity in doing dangerous work well. He thought of his family at home, of the small house that needed repairs, of the children he wanted to educate beyond the life of the mine, and of the hope that someday his work underground would open doors above. Every strike of his pickaxe was a reminder that life was fragile, but it was also a chance to build something, to protect something, to make life better even in small ways. During a brief pause, he leaned against the wall, listening to the mine. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, mixing with the distant hum of machinery. He thought about the stories the older miners told him, about accidents that had happened years before, about times when men had been trapped and the struggle to get them out. Those stories stayed with him, not to scare him, but to teach him. The mine demanded respect, demanded awareness, demanded action, and he had learned to give all three without hesitation. The foreman came closer, checking the area where he was working. "Everything looks good," the man said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for him to hear. It was not praise for effort, but for careful attention, for being alert, for keeping the team safe. He nodded silently, feeling the weight of approval and responsibility at the same time. It was a moment of connection, simple yet profound, built on years of mutual reliance in a dangerous environment. He returned to his work, focused on the next section of rock. The mine seemed deeper than ever, the shadows longer, the air thicker. But he moved with confidence, each step calculated, each action precise. He noticed small changes in the walls, tiny cracks that others might overlook, small shifts in the earth that signaled movement beneath. He filed these observations away mentally, planning to alert the team later, knowing that awareness could make the difference between life and disaster. Around him, life continued in its quiet, dangerous way. Men worked steadily, sometimes exchanging brief words, sometimes silent, communicating through gestures and glances. There was a rhythm to it, a shared understanding that everyone depended on each other, and he felt that connection deeply, the invisible bond that made the mine less lonely, less terrifying, because they were in it together. It was not just labor, it was trust, and it was care, and it was a kind of courage that didn't need recognition. As the hours passed, fatigue began to settle in, but he ignored it. The work demanded attention, and he gave it fully. He reminded himself that the mine had no mercy for mistakes, and that every movement mattered. He checked on a younger miner who seemed distracted, offering guidance on lifting a particularly heavy section of rock. The young man nodded, grateful, and returned to work with a bit more confidence. Moments like these reminded him why he did what he did, not for money or praise, but for the safety and dignity of those around him. By midday, a faint rumble echoed through the tunnels. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he noticed immediately. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from instinct. Years of experience had trained him to listen, to sense, to anticipate. He glanced at the walls, at the ceiling, at the men nearby. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but he knew better than to ignore the signs. The mine was unpredictable, and he had learned to respect that unpredictability with vigilance. The foreman appeared again, moving carefully toward him. There was concern in his eyes, and he gestured toward the deeper tunnel. "Be careful down there," he said simply. The words were ordinary, but they carried weight. They were a reminder of danger, of responsibility, of the bond between a leader and a man who could be counted on. He nodded, acknowledging the caution, and turned back to his work, more alert than ever. He understood that the mine demanded attention not just from him, but from everyone who walked its narrow paths, and he was ready to meet that demand. As the afternoon sun barely touched the entrance of the mine, shadows grew longer, the air became heavier, and the sense of tension grew subtly. He moved with precision, aware of every sound, every vibration, every shift in the rock. He wasn't thinking about heroism or fear. He was simply acting as he had been trained, as he had learned through years of labor and observation. He was protecting not just himself but those around him, and that was instinctual, not calculated. He paused for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow, taking in the sights, sounds, and smells of the mine. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also a place of life, of purpose, of human connection. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, heavy but not unwelcome. He knew that life could change in an instant in this place, and he wanted to be ready for it. Little did he know that change was coming sooner than he expected, and the choices he would make in the moments ahead would not only define his courage, but alter the course of his life forever. The day had started like any other, with the rhythm of work guiding every movement in the mine. Pickaxes struck rock, dust swirled in the faint light, and men worked quietly, each step calculated, each swing deliberate. But beneath the calm surface, the mine was restless. He had sensed it. That tiny tremor earlier that seemed insignificant, a whisper of warning, but he had shrugged it off. The mine always hummed and shifted slightly. Nothing ever came of it, at least not most days. Today would be different. It began with a low groaning sound, deep within the mine, almost imperceptible at first. He paused, picking up his tool mid-swing, his ears straining. The vibration ran through the walls, subtle but steady like the warning beat of a drum. He exchanged a glance with a fellow miner nearby. Their eyes met, silent acknowledgement passing between them. Something wasn't right. The younger men around him hesitated, unsure, while the older workers tried to reassure them with calm words, though their own faces betrayed concern. Then it happened, a sudden, violent shift. The walls of rock around him trembled, dust falling in thick clouds. A deafening crack split the air as a section of the ceiling gave way. Rocks rained down like hail, striking the ground with thunderous force. Screams erupted immediately, echoing through the tunnels, mixing with the sound of falling debris and the roar of collapsing stone. The familiar rhythm of the mine was gone, replaced by chaos, fear, and raw survival instinct. Instinct took over. Without thinking, he lunged forward as a massive rock threatened to crush his boss, who had been inspecting a nearby shaft. The boss barely had time to react, frozen in shock as the debris barreled toward him. He grabbed the man's arm, pulling with every ounce of strength he had, dragging him out of the path of destruction just as the rock crashed where he had been standing. Dust filled his lungs, making it hard to breathe, and his ears rang from the impact, but he didn't stop. He barely had time to register relief before more chunks of rock fell around them. Around him, other miners were scrambling for safety, some trapped under debris, some injured, others frozen in fear. The air was thick with dust, choking and blinding. He coughed violently, waving his free hand in front of his face, trying to see through the haze. His heart pounded not from exhaustion but from urgency, the pressing need to act quickly, to protect, to survive. Every second mattered. The boss, shaken but unhurt, grabbed his shoulder. "Are you okay?" he shouted over the roar. He barely heard it, his focus on the tunnels, on the shifting rocks, on the men around him. "Stay close! Keep moving!" he yelled back, grabbing a younger miner who had been pinned by a smaller rock. Together they lifted the debris just enough for him to slip free, then helped him toward a safer part of the tunnel. Everywhere he looked, men were in danger. A worker farther down the tunnel was trapped under a fallen beam. Another had twisted his ankle and couldn't run. He moved quickly, dodging falling rocks, keeping his eyes sharp for loose walls above. He reached the injured man, signaling for help from others who were nearby, guiding them to lift the beam just enough to free him without causing further collapse. The younger miner he had helped earlier stayed close, trusting him completely, following his instructions without question. Time became distorted. Seconds stretched into minutes as the chaos continued around them. Dust hung in the air, making breathing difficult, blinding them momentarily. The mine seemed alive, shifting unpredictably, each tremor more violent than the last. He could hear faint cries for help echoing from deeper tunnels, and his chest tightened. He knew he couldn't save everyone at once, but he focused on what he could do, starting with those closest to him. A particularly large section of rock shifted suddenly, threatening to cut off their escape route. He grabbed a pickaxe lying nearby and struck at the supporting beams, trying to create a controlled collapse, a way for the rock to fall safely without endangering the men around him. Sparks flew as metal met rock, dust and small stones falling like rain. Sweat mixed with dirt on his face, burning his eyes, but he didn't stop. The men around him followed his lead, moving with coordination born not of practice but of urgent necessity. Through the chaos, the boss stayed close, relying on him completely. It was a reversal of roles, a moment where trust and courage intersected. The boss had often guided him in work, but now he depended on the man's instincts to survive. And he delivered. He guided, pulled, lifted, and shielded, acting as if the mine itself was a puzzle he had to solve instantly, protecting human lives as he moved. The dust began to settle slightly, enough for them to see. Several men were safe, but others were injured or trapped. He ran to a worker caught under a heavy slab, shouting instructions, positioning himself to take the brunt of any further falling rock. His arms ached, muscles burning, but he ignored it. Fear was present, yes, but it was sharp and clear, a guiding force rather than a paralyzing one. His mind worked fast, calculating, assessing risks, deciding who needed immediate attention and what actions could prevent further disaster. One of the younger miners, terrified and crying, stumbled backward into a small cavity. He reached out instinctively, grabbing the boy's hand, holding him close to prevent injury from falling debris. "You're going to be okay. Stay with me," he shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos. The boy nodded, trembling, but found courage in the man's presence. He guided him to a safer section, shielding him with his own body whenever rocks fell too close. The mine continued to groan, each sound sharper and more ominous than the last. He could feel the vibrations under his boots, the subtle shifts in the rock above. He stayed alert, moving strategically, not wasting a single moment. He noticed a small section where the ceiling had weakened dangerously, signaling the possibility of another collapse. He called out to the men nearby, instructing them to move, helping guide them along a safer path. His voice carried authority without arrogance, calm yet urgent, cutting through the panic like a lighthouse in a storm. The boss looked at him in a moment of awe, realizing the depth of courage and quick thinking the man possessed. There were no words to capture it, only the shared understanding that life depended on this man's instincts and bravery. And yet he didn't hesitate to act, not for recognition, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. Every decision was about saving lives, about protecting those who could not protect themselves. Hours felt like minutes as the situation slowly stabilized. Rescue teams would eventually arrive, but until then, it was up to him and the other miners to survive. They worked together, clearing paths, helping the injured and guiding those who were disoriented. His energy never faltered, his focus unwavering. He was everywhere at once, a protector in the chaos, the anchor in the storm. Eventually, the shaking lessened, the sounds of falling rocks became sporadic, and the immediate danger subsided. The survivors, exhausted and covered in dust, began to gather in a safer section of the mine. His boss stood nearby, breathing heavily, looking around at the men he had relied on but now saw in a completely new light. The gravity of the situation and the courage displayed was clear. He stepped forward, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "You saved more than my life today," he said quietly, the weight of gratitude in his voice. He shook his head, brushing dust from his clothes. "I did what anyone would do," he replied, though he knew the truth. Not everyone could have acted like that. Fear would have frozen most men, and panic would have driven others to make mistakes. But he had acted with clarity, with purpose, with care for others above himself. That was what made the difference, and that difference had saved lives. As the dust settled and the first faint rays of sunlight penetrated the mine's entrance, he looked around at the survivors. Some were limping, some were bruised, some were shaken to the core, but all were alive. And that was what mattered. His body ached from exertion, his lungs burned from dust, but a deep sense of fulfillment filled him. He had protected those around him, and nothing else mattered in that moment. Even as rescue teams approached, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The mine had proven its danger, its unpredictability, its ability to shift life in an instant. But he had faced it not with bravado, not with recklessness, but with courage, care, and precision. He had moved through chaos like a calm force, protecting those around him, and in doing so had changed something inside himself. He had seen the fragility of life, the weight of responsibility, and the power of decisive action. And though the day was far from over, though injuries would need attention and the mine itself would need repair, he knew one thing clearly. He had acted with integrity, courage, and heart. In the midst of fear, in the chaos of falling rock and dust, he had stood firm. He had protected lives, including the life of the man who had always guided him, but now relied on him completely. And in that moment, the first seeds of a life-changing recognition began to take root, though neither he nor anyone else could yet see how far-reaching it would be. The dust hung in the air like a heavy curtain, drifting slowly through the tunnels even as the shaking of the mine had finally stopped. Every miner who had survived the collapse was breathing hard, coughing, blinking against the thick haze that made it difficult to see. The sounds of the mine were quieter now, but every creak and groan made their hearts skip a beat. They had escaped immediate danger, but the aftermath brought a new kind of tension. The mine was alive with fear, pain, and relief all at once. He crouched beside a worker who had twisted his ankle during the collapse. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "You're okay," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're going to get you out of here." The injured man nodded, gripping his shoulder for support as he guided him carefully along the uneven ground. He moved slowly, mindful of each step because one wrong move could send loose rocks tumbling again. The younger miners followed his lead, their fear tempered by the calm authority in his movements. They trusted him, not just because he had saved their lives in the collapse, but because he had shown them how to stay alive when chaos ruled. The boss, who had been pulled to safety moments before, was leaning against a wall, catching his breath. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, and his hands shook slightly. He looked around at the men, realizing just how close they had come to disaster. His gaze fell on him, the man who had acted without hesitation to pull him out of harm's way. There was an unspoken acknowledgement in that look, a recognition of courage and loyalty that words could not fully capture. But he only nodded quietly and returned his attention to the workers, helping where he could. The mine's ventilation system had been damaged during the collapse, and the air was thick with dust and debris. Every breath was heavy, every cough a reminder of the danger they had just escaped. He signaled to the others to stay low and move slowly, guiding them toward a slightly more open section where the air was cleaner. Some of the older miners grumbled, exhausted and scared, but they followed without complaint. He had learned long ago that leadership was not about giving orders. It was about showing the way and ensuring everyone felt safe enough to follow. Rescue teams were on their way, but they were still some distance from the mine. Until they arrived, it was up to the miners themselves to stabilize the area, help the injured, and make sure no one else was trapped. He moved from one group to another, checking on everyone, assessing injuries, and offering instructions. "Stay together," he said firmly. "Help each other. We get everyone out safely, one step at a time." His voice carried calm authority, the kind that made even the most frightened men feel a small measure of control in the midst of chaos. One of the younger miners was crying softly, sitting on the ground and holding his head. He knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now. You made it through. That's what matters." The boy nodded, tears mixing with dust on his face. He stayed there for a moment, letting him recover, knowing that emotional recovery was as important as physical safety. Trauma could linger long after the rocks had stopped falling, and he understood that. The boss approached, holding a flashlight that barely cut through the thick dust. "We need to make sure everyone is accounted for," he said. "I need your help." He nodded without hesitation. Together they moved from group to group, checking faces, confirming that everyone who had been in the tunnels at the time of the collapse was alive. There were injuries, cuts, bruises, twisted ankles, but everyone had survived the worst. The realization brought a mix of relief and exhaustion. Outside the immediate danger zone, a few miners were helping clear smaller debris to create safer pathways. He joined them, picking up rocks, lifting beams, and directing others to ensure no further collapse could happen. The work was exhausting, and every movement reminded him of the day's earlier chaos, but it had to be done. Lives depended on it, and there was no time for hesitation. Every action mattered, and he moved with precision, not letting fear dictate his choices. The injured were being guided to safer sections, where they could sit, rest, and receive first aid once it arrived. He stayed close to them, offering water, blankets, and encouragement. Some of the men were scared to move, still haunted by the moments when the ceiling had crashed down around them. He stayed with them, speaking quietly, letting them know they were not alone. His presence, steady and unwavering, became a kind of anchor in the storm of fear. When the first faint sounds of rescue teams reached the tunnels, the miners' spirits lifted slightly. The sound of voices and equipment echoed faintly, signaling help was near. He guided the workers toward these sounds, making sure the injured were moved carefully, the path clear and stable. It was a slow process requiring patience and careful coordination, but he moved with determination, ensuring everyone remained calm and safe. As the rescue teams entered the mine, they were met with the scene of exhausted men covered in dust and blood but alive. The teams quickly assessed the situation, taking over the rescue efforts while he continued to assist, guiding them toward the injured and pointing out areas of concern. His knowledge of the mine, the way it shifted, and the sections that were now dangerous made him an invaluable asset to the rescuers. Without his guidance, the process would have been slower and more perilous. The boss stood nearby, observing quietly. He had recovered enough to walk, but the gratitude he felt was deeper than words could express. He approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the day's events and the realization of what had been avoided. He shook his head, brushing it off. "You don't need to thank me," he replied simply. "We all did what had to be done." But the boss knew that it was his actions, his courage, and his quick thinking that had made the difference between life and death. The injured were slowly being moved toward the surface, the first faint sunlight filtering down into the tunnels, giving a sense of hope and relief. He stayed behind briefly, ensuring that everyone was accounted for, that no one was left trapped or overlooked. The adrenaline that had carried him through the collapse was fading, replaced by exhaustion, aching muscles, and a deep sense of fulfillment. He had faced the worst of the mine's fury and emerged with lives preserved. Even as the miners were guided out, the emotional weight of the day settled heavily on everyone. Some men silently wept, overwhelmed by fear, relief, and gratitude. Others whispered thanks to those around them, particularly to him whose bravery had been the difference between survival and tragedy. He remained calm, focusing on practical needs, checking for injuries, ensuring everyone stayed hydrated, and helping those who were struggling to walk. The heroism of the day was quiet, rooted in care and action, not in celebration or recognition. Outside, the first responders were coordinating, setting up triage areas, and assisting the miners out of the dark tunnels into the sunlight. The contrast between the dark, suffocating mine and the bright open world above was striking. Miners squinted against the light, coughing and blinking, but relief washed over their faces. They had survived. They were alive, and in the midst of that relief, his calm presence had guided them safely through the chaos. He finally allowed himself to step back, leaning against a rock to catch his breath. The dust in his lungs burned, his muscles ached, and his body shook with exhaustion. Yet despite all that, there was a profound sense of satisfaction. He had acted without hesitation, without concern for personal safety, driven only by the need to protect others. That courage, that instinct had saved lives, and in doing so, it had quietly shifted the way people around him saw him, not just as a miner, but as a man capable of extraordinary bravery. The boss approached once more, this time standing a little taller, dusting himself off. He looked around at the men, then back at him and said softly, "You saved us all today. Not just me, you saved all of us." He nodded, not needing to respond. The truth was evident in the actions, in the way he had moved through the chaos, guiding, protecting, and ensuring that no one else was lost. Recognition was not necessary for him. The lives saved were enough. As the last of the miners were led safely out of the mine, the rescue teams began to stabilize the tunnels, assessing damage and ensuring that no further collapse could happen. He stayed nearby, offering his knowledge of the mine's structure, helping identify weak points and ensuring the area was safe for anyone who might need to enter. Even after the immediate danger had passed, his sense of responsibility remained strong. He had witnessed firsthand how quickly life could change underground, and he was determined that no one else would be taken by surprise. By the time the sun was fully overhead, the mine had been cleared as much as possible, the injured attended to, and the survivors gathered outside. The air was still thick with dust, but there was a sense of relief, of survival, and of community. Men shared quiet words of gratitude, leaning on each other, acknowledging silently the courage it had taken to make it through the ordeal. And throughout it all, he remained calm, steady, a quiet anchor that had guided everyone through the storm. The morning after the collapse was quieter than he expected. The sun rose slowly, spilling golden light across the small mining town. Birds chirped and the wind carried a gentle breeze, but for him, the air felt heavy with memories of the previous day. He had survived, and so had the others, but he could still see the dust, hear the echoes of falling rock, and feel the tension in the muscles of the men he had helped. Despite exhaustion, there was a sense of purpose that stayed with him. He had acted without hesitation, and now the world above ground was beginning to notice. Word of the mine collapse and the lives saved had spread through the community almost immediately. People who had never stepped foot in the tunnels were talking about the heroism displayed by one man who had run toward danger when everyone else ran away. He did not seek recognition, did not imagine standing out, but the story had taken on a life of its own. Neighbors stopped him on the street, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude. Some didn't know him personally, but they had heard enough to know that he had risked everything for others. The boss approached him that morning, a look of seriousness and respect on his face. "I need to talk to you," he said, leading him to a quieter corner of the yard outside the mine. The sun warmed the stone buildings, but he barely noticed it, focused instead on the man who had relied on him so completely yesterday. "What you did, what you risked, it was more than courage. It was leadership, instinct, and heart. I can't ignore it." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He nodded quietly, unsure of what to say. Recognition had never been his goal, Saving lives had been enough. The boss continued, "I want to make sure your family is taken care of. I want to help you find opportunities, ways to make sure this doesn't just end with a thank you." He spoke calmly, but there was intensity in his eyes. He wasn't offering empty praise. He meant every word. He wanted to provide support, education, and security for the man who had put himself in harm's way to protect everyone else. He understood that true courage deserved to be honored in practical, life-changing ways. In the days that followed, the community began to show its appreciation in different ways. Neighbors brought food and blankets, friends helped repair minor damage to his home, and children who had heard the story in school looked at him with admiration. He felt a strange mix of humility and disbelief. He had acted instinctively, and yet people treated him like a hero. He wondered if anyone had ever felt this way without asking for it, without seeking it, simply because they had done what was right. The boss invited him into his office, a small space with a desk cluttered with papers, tools, and charts. "I've been thinking," the boss said. "You've shown qualities that go beyond mining skills. You have judgment, bravery, and a sense of responsibility that can't be taught. I want to offer you a position where you can grow, learn, and make a real difference in this company and community." He explained that the company was willing to support him with training, access to better tools, and even leadership opportunities that could change the trajectory of his life. He listened, absorbing every word. It was more than he had ever expected, more than he had imagined for himself. He had been working in the mine for years, day after day, focused on survival and supporting his family, never thinking beyond the tunnels and the immediate dangers. And now, because of a moment of courage, doors were opening that had seemed unreachable. He felt gratitude, yes, but also a quiet determination. If this opportunity could help him provide more for his family and community, he would take it. Letters arrived from local organizations, schools, and even businesses offering scholarships, training programs, and mentorship opportunities. His children's education, long a source of worry, suddenly seemed more secure. He thought about his neighbors and friends, about the people he had guided through the collapse, and realized that his actions had created ripples far beyond the mine. One day of courage had led to possibilities that would change many lives. He began attending meetings with the boss and company representatives, learning about safety protocols, leadership principles, and the management side of mining operations. The work was challenging in a different way than the mine had been. It required thinking, planning, and communicating rather than swinging a pickaxe or lifting heavy rock. But he approached it with the same intensity, the same determination to do what was right, and the same care for people around him. The skills he had shown instinctively in the collapse now became tools for his growth and development. The other miners watched these changes with curiosity and admiration. Some expressed pride quietly, others with smiles or nods. He remained humble, focusing on learning and helping others, not on praise. Yet the way people looked at him had shifted. He was no longer just a miner, he was a role model, someone who had faced life and death danger and emerged not only alive but changed, stronger, and wiser. Community leaders came to meet him, offering opportunities to speak at events, share his experience, and inspire others. He spoke in simple words, never exaggerating, never making himself larger than life. He wanted people to see that courage wasn't about heroics or recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done, helping others, and staying calm under pressure. People listened, and his story began to encourage others to act with care, responsibility, and bravery in their own lives. Even with new responsibilities and recognition, he never forgot the mine. He continued to visit, checking on the men, sharing guidance, and ensuring that safety measures were improved. He knew that many people still relied on the mine for survival, and that meant he had a duty to protect and support them. His actions had begun in instinctive heroism, but now they extended into leadership and mentorship. He guided younger miners, showing them how to stay aware, how to act with caution and care, and how to look out for each other in the most dangerous conditions. His family noticed the changes too. They felt more secure, more confident in the future, and proud of the man who had quietly risked everything for others. They spoke of him with admiration and gratitude, and he felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal achievement. Life was opening up, not only for him but for the people he loved and the community he had helped. The recognition was not the reward. Seeing lives improved and people inspired was the true measure of success. The boss continued to support him, offering guidance, advice, and opportunities to grow within the company. He trusted the man completely, knowing that he could rely on him for difficult decisions and challenging situations. Their relationship had transformed, evolving from employer and employee into one of mutual respect, trust, and understanding. The boss had seen courage firsthand, and he knew that it deserved acknowledgement and support that went beyond words. Local media began to cover his story in more detail, highlighting his actions during the collapse and the way he had guided others to safety. Interviews focused on his humility, his care for fellow workers, and the practical steps he had taken to ensure survival. He spoke simply, avoiding exaggeration or dramatization, and people admired him even more for it. His story became a symbol of quiet heroism, the kind that often goes unnoticed but has the power to change lives profoundly. With every day that passed, opportunities expanded. Programs for professional development, safety leadership, and community support became available, and he embraced each one. He learned about management, safety planning, and mentorship, applying the same attention to detail and responsibility he had shown in the mine. Each new skill added to his confidence. Each achievement reinforced the understanding that courage combined with care and dedication could transform not only his life, but the lives of many others. Even in small moments, the changes were visible. Neighbors treated him differently, colleagues respected his judgment, and his children began to dream bigger for their own futures. He still worked in the mine occasionally, not because he had to, but because he cared about the people there. He guided, he trained, and he inspired, ensuring that no one faced danger without the knowledge and support to survive. The collapse had been a defining moment, but the way he carried himself afterward created a ripple of positive change that reached far beyond that single day. By the end of the month, it was clear that his life was transforming. Recognition, yes, but more importantly, opportunity, growth, and impact. He had faced death and emerged not only alive but empowered, able to use his courage and instincts to create a better future. And he understood that the true reward of bravery was not in accolades but in the lives touched, the safety ensured, and the hope instilled in those around him. Life had begun to change slowly, almost quietly at first, but the effects were undeniable. The collapse of the mine had left a mark on the community, the workers, and especially on him. The gratitude and recognition he had received were overwhelming at times, but he had never sought them. He had acted instinctively, out of care for the people around him, and now, the world above ground was starting to notice what he had done. Each day brought small reminders that life would never be quite the same again. He woke earlier than usual, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face through the small window of his home. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the sweet aroma of bread his children had baked. He paused for a moment, reflecting on how far things had come. The mine had once seemed like the center of his world, a place of routine, danger, and survival. Now, it felt like one chapter among many, a chapter that had opened doors he had never imagined. The community continued to show their support. Neighbors stopped by regularly, bringing food, helping with repairs, or simply sharing kind words. People who had only known him as a miner now saw him as someone who had demonstrated courage, leadership, and care. Children stared with wide eyes when they saw him, inspired by the stories of his bravery. Even strangers on the street would nod or shake his hand, acknowledging the man who had acted without fear to protect lives. Each gesture reminded him that courage, even quiet courage, had a power that reached far beyond the moment it was shown. The boss had kept his promise. He introduced him to new opportunities, including advanced training programs, leadership,